Welcome back to the Wise Up podcast, where we deliver you a weekly dose of business wisdom. I'm your host, Chris Albrecht. And I am, well, let's just say it. I'm happy to be talking to my guest today. I've known her for a long time, but she is amazing. She is Valerie Alexander. She is a keynote speaker and founder and CEO of Speak Happiness. Welcome to the show, Valerie.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Okay, so what is Speak Happiness?
Speak Happiness is my company. It got started after I wrote the book Happiness as a Second Language, which is based on the idea that if we need to learn happiness, we shouldn't just read one article and think that's going to do the job. We have to retrain our brains for happiness the same way you would to retrain your brain if you were trying to learn a brand new language. It takes years, it takes multiple aspects of study, it takes practice, there's failure. So if people saw happiness that way, then they would give themselves the time and the resources to develop a happier baseline. So from that, I have a certification in the science of happiness from Berkeley, it's also where I got my law degree. So I have a particular affinity for Berkeley. And so I learned a lot more about workplace happiness from doing that. And then I realized that that was really where we needed the most effort in this country and actually in the world is on amplifying happiness in workplaces for so many reasons, which we can get into. So what Speak Happiness is, as a company, I'm a keynote speaker. I'm also a management trainer. I go in and train management on how to amplify the happiness in their workplace, how to create a happier workplace. And I do workplace happiness assessments, which is, I think, my favorite thing in the world to do, to go in and talk to all the employees in a company or a representative sample if there's too many employees, and then report back to management what they do that makes people happy, what they do that makes people unhappy, and what their employees see as solutions to some of their more pressing problems.
All right, because the world is not all Denmark, right? Which is the happiest place year after
Right.
year, right? So
Yes.
I want to know, there's a lot of talk of happiness. There's a lot of literature that's come out around happiness, and you've studied it. But how do you measure it? Like when you go in and you're measuring happiness, what sort of metric are you using? Are you just relying on surveys, or what does that involve?
There are so many both metrics to measure that are also metrics that can be tweaked or altered based on happiness. I tell companies very simply the number one and two things are your turnover and your absenteeism. If you have high turnover, if any department in your company has higher turnover than any other department, that's where people are unhappy. If you have any kind of an absenteeism problem. I work with one of the largest movie chains in the country. They have thousands of screens. And I tell them, track every single, what's called house, track every single house. And if one of them has an absenteeism problem that exceeds everyone else's, you have a manager who needs some happiness training. I'll just put it that way. So it's actually quite easy to measure. A lot of companies do surveys about it. That's a good thing to do to stay on top of it, but it's hard to get employee feedback, especially in a, 12 question questionnaire or whatever. Talk to your employees, you know, ask them. I give away, here is my secret sauce when I do a happiness assessment. And I literally just, this is my intellectual property. I give it away for free, and I'll explain why. My I speak to every employee in the company, or as many as we can get to, with 3 questions. And the CEOs are always quite disgruntled. "I'm sorry, don't you have a 40-page questionnaire?" It's like, "No. How did your last 40-page questionnaire work out?" I have 3 questions I ask. Number 1, tell me about your best day ever working here.
Okay.
And when I hear about that, then I know what the company is doing right, what they should be encouraging. Often it's things that nobody can believe. One workplace, I couldn't believe a significant percentage of employees said, "Oh, it was the day we all volunteered together at the food bank."
Hmm.
That was everybody's best day ever working for that company.
Hmm.
And so you have to tell the company, these are things that matter to your employees. Make sure they're getting more opportunities like this. And there's a lot of things about working at the food bank. You feel like you're doing good, you're making a difference, you're connecting with your fellow employees, you feel you respect your company a little more. So of course, then the second question is, tell me about your worst day ever working here.
Yeah.
And that's where you get to see everything the company is doing wrong. And often I will have 5 people tell me 5 different stories about their worst day ever, but all of those stories revolve around the same corporate policy
Hmm.
or around the same manager.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And that's a really good place. And then my last question is, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about this place, what would you change? And that's where we get employee input because they have a different view. I always say if you're standing on a ladder, no matter where you are on the ladder, the people higher than you have a different view, the people lower than you have a different view. And often management doesn't have the same view as people at the ground level. And they can get a lot of valuable input from just asking, what would you change and how would you change it? So, going back to why I give those questions away is that the job for me isn't asking the questions. The job is listening to the answers. And besides the fact that active listening is a skill, which I wish more leaders would develop, my listening comes from being the person the employee feels safe telling it to.
Got it.
I recently spoke at a conference where we talked about workplace happiness. We talked about training your management. I gave the 3 questions away. And this woman came over to me and she's like, I am going right back and asking my employees those 3 questions. I'm going to make sure they're telling me the truth.
Maybe. Hmm.
Yeah. Well, yeah, a little aggressive. Um, and I think that's one of the things that I love. And I have a huge advantage, not only because I'm listening without any pushback. I
Yeah.
have no reason to get defensive about what they're telling me, but I also don't gaslight the employees. I also
Right.
don't say, "Oh, no, that's not really happening." "Oh,
Well,
come on."
I want to take a quick side. I don't mean to derail us and get into too
"Oh,
much of the
please."
minutia, but I'm wondering, like, if you have a theater chain, right? I'm wondering how happiness works across generations. Like, do you have to weight things differently when speaking with someone who's in like their first job, might still be in high school, right? Versus somebody who is 20 years in the company on the like the corporate side.
Here is the challenge of the person who's 20 years in the company on the corporate side. They've always done things a certain way, and the fact that they're 20 years with the company means that way works for them.
Yeah.
One of the things I fight against, it's another piece of my intellectual property, is what I call accidental managers. People get put in charge of other people without having the requisite managerial skills.
Hmm.
And one of the main reasons that happens is because there are 2 types of senior managers, the kind of people who could institute a managerial training program if they wanted. Some of them are just what you call a natural. They're just natural good leaders. They know how to motivate and get the best out of other people. And so they don't really realize how rare that trait is because it comes naturally to them. And so they think everyone has that trait. So they don't really think about training for managerial skills. The other type are the people who aren't naturally good at it and they've never gotten any training and they think they're just fine. And so they don't believe that anybody else would need training because they never got training and they're doing it great. And they don't really see the areas in which they're not great. So the people who have been doing it for 20 years are a little bit harder to persuade that this kind of training is going to get you significantly better outcomes. So that is one thing generationally that has to be worked on. The other thing generationally is that the Gen X generation are the children of the boomers who were the children of the depression generation. So when you're just 2 generations removed from the depression, suck it up, buttercup is kind of the belief of most people when it comes to your job. I have a little video clip I use from The Simpsons where Homer Simpson says, Lisa, when you hate your job, you don't go on strike. You just show up every single day and do it really half-ass.
Yeah.
And it's like, that is kind of a belief. Like hating your job was never a reason to leave that job.
Right.
So now we have millennials and we have Gen Z coming into the workplace and they're saying, nope, I'm not going to stay in a job that makes me miserable. And guess what? They're right. They're right. And I think if we start paying better attention to this and we say, okay, wait, I have to fix this job. I have to fix the managerial behavior. I have to fix the way a workforce is treated to keep this workforce. And by the way, millennials are everybody under 42.
Yeah.
So they were the first generation that were listened to by their parents. Like when I was a kid, my dad was at IBM. We moved every single year. We moved all over the country, and packing up and moving was just the thing you did the following year. I had a friend in my generation who their family was going to move to take a better job. And they said, yeah, we have to talk to the kids and make sure they're okay with it.
Mm.
I'm like, what
No, that's,
concept is that? Sorry,
yeah.
what? And so and also this generation, there's a very good speaker named Seth Madison who talks about working with millennials and younger generation. And he has the line where he says, they've been the CTO in their house since they were 12.
Right.
And so we can't bring a generation into a workforce where they have been listened to, where they have been respected, where their opinion mattered, and say, okay, now do it our way. It's my way or the highway. Or I don't care if you're miserable.
Yeah.
I have a part in one of my keynotes where I talk about one of my bosses once did something that was going to make me very badly treated. And my manager told him that's not going to make Valerie happy. And his response was, why should I care if some waitress is happy? And I will share with you, if you're a boss and your attitude is, why should I care if these people are happy? Your company is not going to do well for very long.
So let's explore that for a second, right? Like, how do you get let's first level set, right? So how does happiness impact corporate success, right? Now you can say right off the top with the questions you ask, right? Like churn, turnover, absenteeism, right? Like that obviously will weigh down productivity. But are there other ways that happiness impacts a corporate success?
When I had LASIK eye surgery, there were 4 big LASIK eye centers in San Francisco, and I went to all of them and I spoke to all of them to see which one I wanted to choose to do the LASIK eye surgery. And I only had one question: what is the turnover here?
Mm.
Because I knew that high turnover was a result of unhappiness, and I didn't want unhappy people working on my eyes.
Right.
Because, as it turns out, and this is Gallup has been studying workplace happiness for 3 decades now, and the statistics are off the charts. If you have a chance, download the State of the American Workforce. That's where the statistics like this are, but I'm going to share some of them with you. So why am I asking a medical office if they're happy? Because when workplaces are very happy in the top quartile compared to the very unhappy, the bottom quartile, there are 58% fewer patient safety incidents.
Mm.
Your malpractice rate goes down by 58% if you're in a medical setting by having a happy workplace. In manufacturing, there are 40% fewer product defects when you have a happy workplace. There's 28% less shrinkage. And that's not just your employees stealing and letting their friends steal. That's also, the person who left the 50-pound sack of shrimp out of the freezer because they just don't care.
Right.
So that goes down by 28%. And here is the biggest number. There are 70% fewer employee safety incidents, meaning workers' compensation claims.
Yeah.
Workers' compensation claims, and on average, the workers' compensation claims of the very happy workforce are lower in dollar amount as well. But 70% fewer workers' compensation claims. And I recently spoke to a conference where an executive from Ferrari came to me afterwards and he said, how does this impact healthcare costs? Because that was one of the challenges that he said every executive faces. And so I looked it up and I found out there's a researcher named Sonia Lubomirsky at UC Riverside in California, and she studies this, and she had a paper came out that shows I can't say healthcare costs, she didn't associate with healthcare costs, but healthcare outcomes. Your workplace is significantly healthier when it's a happy workplace. So think about that in terms of your health insurance costs. There are so many more stats than this.
So, all right. So you have a lot of stats, right? But I too am like of Gen X, right? So I am of the suck it up buttercup sort
Right.
of milieu, disposition, whatever, right? And so what I'm wondering is when you go into corporate, you work with corporate workplaces, obviously, right? So I can imagine them going like happiness, that's squishy, that's not like that's not a very solid, concrete sort of thing. So how do you work to get them to understand the importance of it? Is it just rattling off statistics, or how do you win over people who are skeptical?
Part of it is rattling off statistics. I will share. That is a way to convince the CEO that you need a happiness program, that you need to do a happiness assessment. Part of the other thing is a little bit of executive education where I say, I cannot give you KPIs. I cannot tell you um, in 4 months you're going to get this result. It's not good. Now, you can start tracking absenteeism and turnover. You can start tracking things like theft, if you have that kind of trackability, or even workers' compensation claims, if you're in manufacturing, you can do a happiness assessment and happiness training in one part of your business and not do it in the other part of the business. And then 2 years later, even 1 year later, you can do you can look at the metrics between those two parts of your business. And I promise you will see a difference. And I can give one little anecdote that shares this. It's very interesting, which is there's a grocery store in California I used to shop at called Sprouts. And the Sprouts in Granada Hills, California was a miserable place to shop. They had great products and they had great prices. So I still shopped there. But it was miserable to shop there. You always had a surly experience. It didn't matter if it was the butcher shop or the produce department. And there was one cashier who was just particularly unpleasant. I would avoid her uh, aisle when I was coming through. And then one day I saw her name tag said head cashier, and I was like, oh, makes it even worse. But then over time, I started noticing it got a little nicer. It got a little more friendly. And I had one visit there where everybody was very helpful. The butcher was helpful. Everybody was just nice and friendly. And then I went through Miss Head Cashier's line and she was super friendly. And I thought, this is insane. So I said, I think I need to talk to the manager. Because by the way, I always want to talk to the manager when I have a good experience. I'm try to rarely be the person who complains to the manager, but I always want to tell the manager when I had a good experience. Not enough people do that. Let's give positive feedback as much as possible. But so I said to this manager, I have to tell you, this place has become really a wonderful place to shop, and I really enjoy it coming here now. I said the work staff has changed so much in the last 6 months. They're really friendly, they're really helpful, and I don't know what you're doing differently, but it's working. And he looked at me and said, "Oh, I wouldn't know. I've only been here 5 months."
So, Valerie, your book is titled Happiness as a Second Language, right? Which I think sort of kicked off this whole pursuit for you, right? And I'm wondering, why do you think it's important to look at it through a language speaking lens, happiness?
All the work I've done for the last 2 decades is based in brain science. I'm kind of a brain science wonk. I'm very fascinated by it. Started with learning about the evolution of the brain, when we went from having the size of a meatball 2 million years ago to having this head of cauliflower that we all have today, how the prefrontal cortex evolved into existence. And I learned a lot about sort of cognitive therapy and the fact that we actually control building uh, synaptic pathways in our own brains. We can do that. Also, the brain imprints negative messages 7 times more strongly than it imprints positive messages. And again, that's an evolutionary effect. The human brain needed to remember these berries are poisonous. It didn't need to remember these berries are delicious. The human ear is more attuned to lower pitched sounds than higher pitched sounds because a growl is much more dangerous than a chirp.
Hmm.
And so in looking at all of that and just putting it all together, I realized, oh, we actually then can control building new neural pathways. We from the minute we come out of the womb, we start exploring our world with all of our senses. And the very first thing a baby learns literally is food comes in the mouth, because up to that point it was coming through a tube in the stomach, but now food goes in the mouth. So that's why babies are trying to put everything in their mouth. They're trying to figure out what is, what isn't food.
Hmm.
The first time that a baby like grabs the remote control, sticks it in the mouth, the synaptic pathway is like, is this food? That's the question. Is this food? And choo, 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 not food. But the second time they pick up the remote control, it's like choo, 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 not food. By the third time they pick up the remote control, choo, choo, not food. And that building that synaptic pathway, then it turns out we can view them microscopically and we can see that the more a neural pathway is traveled, the smoother it gets, the faster it gets, the deeper it gets. And I bring that up because when people say you're in a rut, you might truly be in a rut. You might have a neural pathway in your brain that has formed a little rut that makes it very easy for that message to travel over that pathway. If it's the not food message, great. And it turns out then we can extrapolate that to other things. I don't need to put everything in my mouth after that to know what is and isn't food, although some
Right.
things. But if we can build neural pathways, then we can reinforce ideas in a way that, we all built neural pathways for the language we speak without realizing it, without knowing what's happening. But if you look at what point did you really start speaking that language, it was probably 3 to 3.5 years of intense immersion.
Right.
And if we're going to build neural pathways for happiness, then we're going to have to do it immersively, the way we would learn a language. And so start with a practice of happiness. I have in the book, in Happiness as a Second Language, we have all kinds of techniques and practices and exercises you can do. I never read another happiness book before I wrote this book. I spent months going to the Los Angeles Public Library every day in the language lab and going through all the language books
Hmm.
to learn, how do you teach a new language? And so the book starts out very simple, very basic, just 1 or 2 exercises, learning how to say you're happy, learning how to just rattle off things that are making you happy, learning how to block the unhappy signals when they're coming in. And then it gets in a much more intense and deep um, exercises, how to release the things that are making you unhappy, how to release the harm, how to respect yourself. The primary verb of happiness is respect. And if you have to treat others with respect, you have to treat yourself with respect. And that's the baseline for happiness. The other thing that I have a message is it's about lasting permanent happiness. And I get pushback. People say there's no such thing as permanent happiness. I was like, no, I'm not saying you're happy all the time. I'm saying every day you work to raise that happiness baseline, because the higher you can get that baseline, that's what you bounce back to. The quicker you bounce back when you get knocked off, and the higher level you get back to. So I always am a happy person. I am always a happy person. That doesn't mean I'm never mad or angry or sad or disappointed, but even in my worst days, and Chris and I go way back, we've had some very, very challenging days. And even in my worst days, I could tell myself I'm a happy person. And I knew that when I got out of it, it wouldn't have changed that. I would still be a happy person, no different than speaking my language. Or, I make it akin to religion. The religion you practice doesn't go away because it gets challenged. In fact, it
Right.
might get reinforced by that.
Well, Valerie, this has been fascinating. If people wanted to find out more, where is the best place for them to look? And I'm gonna not say it's the happiest place on earth. I'm gonna say that it is. It's
Uh,
not in Disneyland. If people wanted to find out more, not only you have your book, but then also you do keynotes and workshops. What's the best place for people to find you?
that would be Speak Happiness. That's SPEAK, speakhappiness.com is the best place to reach out. There's a contact form. You can get in touch with me directly. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I have a mailing list on happiness and inclusion, because the most successful, productive workplaces are the ones that are the happiest and the most inclusive of all identities. So I really want people to embrace that idea that if you work to make your workplace happier, you work to make your workplace more inclusive, you are going to get outsized outcomes So come find me, speakhappiness.com.
Valerie Alexander is a keynote speaker, founder, and CEO of Speak Happiness, and as we learned today, a happy person. Valerie, thank you for being on the show.
It was my absolute pleasure, Chris.